They say, welcome everyone. This is the third Indigenous education session from the Center for Race and Culture. We're very grateful to have Victoria Pruden with us today. We'll be talking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis across Canada. This session is made possible by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. That's how we're able to offer these for free for everyone. So we'll go on with the program now today. Start off, of course, with the land acknowledgement. The Center for Race and Culture respectfully acknowledges that we are on Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homeland, and that we live and work on all traditional homelands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. We honor the elders, past and present, who call this land home and strive to understand our shared colonial history and work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all people. If this is your first time attending this session, you might not know me. My name is Joshua Morin. I am the Indigenous Education Specialist at CFRAC. I recently joined the team there in July. We've been very grateful to offer these Indigenous education sessions. If I was to introduce myself in Michif, it would be âpahkowâyânaw, Josh Morin de Shinakashun, Mistai Sagan, Pe Manitou Sagan, Dus Chin, in Michif Mia, and Ni Kishkwan Nidang Michif. And that translates to hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Joshua Morin. My family comes from the historic Métis communities of St. Albert, right here in Alberta, and also Lac St. Anne. And I am Métis, and I speak a little bit of the language that some may call Michif. So let's welcome today's speaker, Victoria Pruden. Her pronouns are she and her. She is the Director of Operations at the La Femme Michif Otipimswak, the Women of the Métis Nation. So I'm very excited to have Victoria with us today. As I said before, I consider her a really good friend to our family. She's a good friend to my mom. As I say, you never know. We can look in our family tree and we might realize that we're actually cousins in that sense, because that's how it works. So as I say, I'm just very grateful. Victoria's very knowledgeable in what we're going to be talking about today. So as I say, I'm just very honored to have her with us for this session. With Victoria's bio, Victoria was born in Edmonton, so she is from here and is from a mixed heritage Métis family. She grew up with her parents, George and Myrtle Pruden, in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and has always identified as Red River Métis. Her Métis lineage is from the Pruden, Delorme, Landry, and that's already one last name that I'm pretty sure might be in our family, Falcon, Pichet, Grant, and Grant would be another one too, Grant families, and many more. She is the mother of a 14-year-old Métis son, Quennis Pruden Legret. Is that how you say the last part?
It's Legret.
Legret, okay.
Just draw on your French heritage there.
Yeah, literally. No, thank you so much for that. Always important to get the names right. And is committed to raising him with a grounded knowledge of women issues and understanding of intersectional feminism. As a Métis changemaker, her passion is to ensure that Métis women's voices are included, listened to, and reflected in policy and programs at all levels of government. Her particular interests involve empowerment and advocacy for vulnerable Métis and other Indigenous women and women impacted by trauma. Victoria has worked in Métis and women-focused work since 2000, having worked for the Métis Nation, British Columbia for 7 years, a women's serving nonprofit organization for 15 years, and as a contractor providing healing programming and workshops both on and off reserve with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit participants. She has a bachelor's degree in communications, a diploma in business administration, and several certificates related to counseling and trauma-informed practice. She is focused on supporting La Femme Michif Otipimswak's work in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls advocacy and supporting the Grandmother's Wisdom Circle and Commemoration Project. Her passion for trauma-informed practice, lateral kindness, healing work, and elevating the Métis voices and other Indigenous women has been the focus of her career and political activities for many years. She is inspired daily by her grandmothers and mother, who are strong women who were resilient through their life's challenges, including intergenerational trauma and domestic violence. Victoria was elected by the Métis Nation of British Columbia Board of Directors as the Women's Provincial Chair in September 2016 and served for 4 years as a Métis political leader at a provincial and national level. She served for many years as a grassroots local Métis leader in the Métis Nation, Greater Victoria, with several terms as president, vice president, and director since 2004. In her current role, she is the director of operations for Le Femme Chef Otipimswak, the national voice for the women of the Métis Nation. And Jane says hi. Jane Kumpf, is it Kumpf? Says hello, Victoria. I hope I got that one right too.
Hi, Jane. Nice to see you. I'm glad you're here.
Awesome. So I will only have a couple slides after this one. I believe that this topic, it absolutely should be led by a woman. And I'm very grateful to have, as I say, Victoria here with us. So today we are talking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis across Canada. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women stands for, well, the MMIW stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. It's a movement that advocates for the end of violence against Indigenous women. It also seeks to draw the attention to the high rates of disappearances and murders of Native people, particularly women and girls. And that comes from a website called wearenative.org. So just to give you an idea on what we're talking about today. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls launched on September 1st, 2016, and it's presented its final report to families, survivors, Indigenous leaders, as well as federal, provincial, territorial governments at a closing ceremony in Gatineau, Quebec on June 3rd, 2019. The inquiry calls for 231 imperative changes. So currently, this was from APTN News right on October 4th, 2021. There are more than 1,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women cases in Canada, according to the RCMP, and as many as 4,000 according to activists and families. This photo here comes from Christy Belcourt via her Twitter page. She's a Métis artist and she's done a lot of great work. This comes from a project that she's done called the Walking with Her Sisters Commemorative Project, which honors missing and murdered Indigenous women. Just on that project, and then I'll swing it over to Victoria here. When it comes to the Walking with Her Sisters project, it's a commemorative art installation for the missing and murdered Indigenous women of Canada. I think it might have ended now, but you can absolutely watch a ton of videos, and they have quite a bit of resources on this, which are pretty. It's pretty powerful. This project that they did. So over 1,000 Native women and girls in Canada have been reported missing and murdered in the last 30 years. Many vanished without a trace, with inadequate inquiry into their disappearances or murderers, paid by the media, the general public, politicians, and even law enforcement. This is a travesty of justice. Walking with Our Sisters is, by all accounts, a massive commemorative art installation project comprised of more than 1,700 pairs of moccasin vamps, the tops, the parts that you can see in the picture, the parts that they bead on. Plus 108 pairs of children vamps created and donated by hundreds of caring and concerned individuals to draw attention to this injustice. Each pair of vamps, or the uppers, represents one missing or murdered Indigenous woman. The unfinished moccasin represents the unfinished lives of the women whose lives were cut short. The children's vamps are dedicated to the children who never returned home from residential schools. Together, the installation represents all these women paying respects to their lives and existence to this earth. They are not forgotten. They are sisters, mothers, aunties, daughters, cousins, grandmothers, wives, partners. You could even include friends in that one too. They have not, they have been cared for, they have been loved, they are missing, and they are not forgotten. That comes from the walkingwithoursisters.ca website. So that's another, absolutely, I would recommend folks checking that one out. We will include that in the resource list that we have. So I will stop sharing here and I am going to swing it over to Victoria.
Thank you so much, Josh. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria Pruden, as Josh said, and I'm really delighted to be your featured speaker this afternoon around this topic. And before I get sharing the presentation that I prepared, maybe what I'll do is I'll just introduce myself in one of our languages first. So, Tansakakiao, Kasipikokapwat, Beasus Kotu Squeo Nisika Son. Ligwa Victoria Pruden, Nisika Son. And I just shared the traditional name that was given to me in ceremony. And I want to just draw your attention to the sash that I have on this afternoon. And this is a sash that we created along with some Métis youth, along with the Métis women in British Columbia. And this sash was created to build awareness in terms of ending violence against women and girls. And so the Black represents some of the suffering that we can go through when we experience violence or trauma. The white represents the purity of our spirits and how important it is to have faith. And the pink and the magenta in the sash represents just the sacredness and the specialness of women and girls in our lives. And we ran this project, we gave away lapel sashes and really encouraged people to make a commitment to ending violence against women, and also make a commitment to themselves in terms of keeping ourselves safe and holding ourselves sacred. So I just wanted to let you know that I'm wearing this today just in honor of all of the work and commitment that we do in terms of ending violence against all women, and in particular our topic today, which is about ending the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So I'm going to just share my screen with you. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and we've got lots of pauses built in for some discussion as well. So just bear with me for a sec. Okay, so this is just my title slide here. We're going to be exploring issues surrounding the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and 2S, two-spirited people. And we'll talk a little bit about history, we'll talk a little bit about contemporary issues, and I'll share some of my own experiences. I do want to acknowledge, I've got a picture here of some people on the West Coast in their canoes, because I'm calling in today from Victoria, British Columbia, which is the traditional territory of the Lekwungen and Sinchothan speaking peoples. So I live on the traditional territory, which is the traditional territory of the Esquimalt, the Songhees, and the Wasanich peoples here on Vancouver Island. So I always do want to acknowledge that. And my home Métis community here is called the Métis Nation of Greater Victoria. So I want to dedicate the time that I'm spending with you this afternoon to someone who is very special to me. Her name is Pamela Napoleon, and unfortunately, she was murdered several years ago just outside of Fort St. John, just outside of her home community at Blueberry River First Nation, which is in northern British Columbia. And I have a lot of fond memories of Pamela, and it's still painful and touching to think about the time that we spent together, to think about her on her healing journey and the kind of commitments that she was making to herself. Unfortunately, she was murdered by two men who came from her home community, and the way in which she suffered and died was not with a lot of dignity, and it was very violent, and it was very difficult for her children and her family and her community, I think, to process what happened. So I just want to hold up the memory of Pamela Napoleon today. And also, I want to dedicate our talk this afternoon also to the memory of Cindy Gladu. And Cindy is a woman who I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation, who you may have read about in the news, who was murdered by Bradley Barton, who has just undergone another trial recently. He was on trial for her murder. So a very controversial case, a very sad case, and one that's very important for us. You'll have to bear with me. I'm sorry that the lawn is being mowed outside. It'll stop momentarily. And I do want to mention that the organization hosting us this afternoon very generously offered to provide an honoraria to myself. So I've decided to not accept that honoraria, but put it towards Women of the Métis Nation has a fund in support of Cindy Gladu's family. And we call it the Cindy Gladu Memorial Fund. And what we do with that fund is we're able to provide some financial supports to Cindy Gladu's family as they undergo yet more and more experiences having to be a witness and participate in the trial of Bradley Barton. So I'm very grateful that honoraria will be going to Cindy's family. So as we know, the past months and the past weeks, especially since the discovery of our lost children, the first discovery that happened of the 215 at the Kamloops Residential School, we're going through a time of tremendous change, tremendous challenges as Canadians and as Indigenous Canadians. And we're having to go through a lot of healing together, healing individually, in families, in communities, collectively, and as Canadians. I've been really immersed in all of the subjects and the issues and the policies and discussions around missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people, especially in the past year and a half. Many Métis, First Nations, Inuit, urban, rural, status and non-status people contributed to the creation of a 2021 National Action Plan on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 2S. And it's been quite the journey and quite the process. And I'll be happy to reflect about that a little bit more in the presentation as we go on. And maybe, Josh, we can post the links in the chat. I should have actually had the links ready to copy and paste. The National Action Plan had a lot of contributors, not the least of which the National Family Survivors and Survivors Circle, âpahkowâyânaw Inuit Women of Canada, the Assembly of First Nations Women's Council, and of course, Women of the Métis Nation, the Native Women's Association of Canada was involved at the beginning of this process, but have kind of gone on some of their own ways in terms of activism and participation. So there's an excellent web resource for the National Action Plan if you're interested in learning more. And as we know, we just on September 30th had our first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is a huge deal. I think we saw probably more public support and in terms of, Indigenous people's participation and embracing the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation this year. And it was, a bittersweet year with the discovery of more and more and more unmarked graves at residential schools across the country. So it's been a big few weeks for us. So I just want to start off just with a little bit of intention for today's session, just nurturing our common humanity with kindness with each other and sharing our common experiences, either as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, our common struggles, our common strength, and just really kind of touching on the love and resilience that we hold inside. This can be a difficult topic. And I've spent many years promoting trauma-informed practice. We're going to be talking about some difficult life experiences, some of which you may have experienced in your own life, You may find yourself, being triggered or overwhelmed at certain times. So I just want to remind us about some tools for grounding that we all have accessible to us. So being present in the moment, making sure that you're seated in your seat, you can feel your body against the chair or the couch or wherever you happen to be, your feet upon the floor, and just try to come back to the present moment. Some people might use an object to help them be in the present moment, feeling something that you can touch with your hands. Could be a shell like I'm holding, a ring, bracelet, rock, something that you can bring your five senses to. Taking a moment to make sure that you're breathing. When we get triggered or overwhelmed, sometimes we stop breathing for a moment. So just being mindful that you're drawing in some deep, slow breaths can just help get your nervous system back online. Taking a look around you. What can you see? What can you hear? What can you smell? Anything that brings our five senses back into the present moment with us can help. And reminding yourself, of course, that you're safe. And if you don't feel safe, it's a priority to get yourself in a place of safety right away. So hopefully we're all safe and comfortable in our homes or in our offices, wherever we happen to be viewing this presentation today. So who are Indigenous women in Canada? When we're talking about Indigenous women, primarily we're talking about Métis women and girls. We're talking about First Nations women and girls and Inuit women and girls. And in this case, we may be talking about two-spirited folks as well who are parts of our family and communities. So you may see this acronym throughout the presentation and in some of the material that we're going to be talking about today or that you may be viewing online. So we talk about 2SLGBTQIA+ Indigenous people in Canada. And what does that mean? So I'm just going to quickly explain what this acronym means. So two-spirited, which is an Indigenous way of us referring to 2SLGBTQIA+ folks. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, or non-binary. So we're going to just try to be as respectful and inclusive as possible. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the historical context of some of the vulnerability that we experience as Indigenous people, Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited. So you may have talked about some of these subjects in past sessions. The experience of survivors of residential schools and day schools, I should mention here. People who are impacted by the 60s scoop. People who have had child welfare involvement. And as many Indigenous people experience on a daily basis, the experience of racism in Canada, the experience of poverty. Many Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people experience hypersexualization, different forms of marginalization, high-risk situations or lifestyles, which any of the above can contribute to, substance use and vulnerability, experiences of trauma, and experiences of violence. So today I'm going to really be asking all of us to really draw on our senses of empathy for those who are vulnerable. From what I know about in terms of my career of working with women who've experienced trauma and violence, and particularly Indigenous women who've experienced trauma and violence, there's lots of vulnerability there. So today I'm going to be asking us to sit in a place where we're strength-based, where we're non-judgmental, where we're compassionate. We're here seeing all of our common humanity and recognizing that in Canada, we still face systemic discrimination, systemic vulnerability, lack of resources. There can be a distinct difference in terms of how Indigenous people experience police response or RCMP responses. We can face community apathy, impacts of racism, definitely a different sense of safety in our communities, and in rural and urban situations, transportation challenges, which can really undermine our safety. So I thought that one of the things that we should do today is talk a little bit about some of the women and girls who've gone missing or been murdered. And Nina Cordopat is a beautiful young woman, was a beautiful young woman who lived in Edmonton, Alberta, whose life unfortunately ended at the age of 13. And I'm just going to share a little bit about her story. The story that I'm going to be sharing was originally published by Native Women's Association, and I believe it's called The Story of a Sweetheart. So this is Nina. Nina Louise Cordopat is remembered as a beautiful girl with a passion for movies, music, and dancing. She was a gifted artist with a special talent for drawing and writing. Nina wanted to be famous, and she dreamed about becoming a model and an actress. Shortly before her death, she was the winner of a local modeling contest. On April 3rd, 2005, Nina was brutally raped and murdered on a golf course outside of Edmonton. 5 people have been tried in connection with her murder. Nina will be forever cherished by her mother, Picha, her father, Tim, Darcy, Annie, Patrick, Ethan, family, and friends. Nina was born on October 3rd in 1991 in Edmonton. She was an inquisitive infant, very happy, and she brought much joy to her family. Her mother, Picha Atkinson, recalls how Nina would practically try to chew on everything. She attended Aboriginal Head Start, an early childhood development program for Aboriginal children and their families. And as she grew up, she became more vocal and outspoken. Her parents encouraged her to use her voice. They taught her about safety and about standing up for herself. Her mother believes that these early teachings had a strong influence on Nina, who was very compassionate. She liked to take care of people. She did her best to support and encourage classmates who were being picked on, telling them that they were powerful and that they had inner strength. When Nina was only 8 years old, the family moved to the Dunluce area of Edmonton, and her mother recounts a series of bad experiences that occurred during her time there. It started when Nina realized that she could scare her mother by hiding outside after dark. The behavior escalated. Not understanding the significance or the consequences of her words, Nina began to tell people that she was being abused. Her mother and husband tried to address Nina's behavior, but it was too late. Child and Family Services workers were called. Nina was never removed from their home, as child welfare workers found nothing to confirm the allegations. The family later moved to the west end of Edmonton, and after that, her mother says that Nina was much happier and her behavior really improved. Family was very important to Nina, and she had many close relationships. She was the 4th of 6 siblings, and she was very protective of her younger brother and sister. She loved shows like American Idol, Canadian Idol, and America's Next Top Model. Despite her young age, Nina was absolutely determined to realize her dreams and begged her mother to contact a modeling and acting agency in Edmonton. If some reason her mother did not phone when she would, then Nina would make the call herself. She was always looking for ways to make her dreams come true. On March 30th, 2005, Nina said that she'd like to spend the weekend at a friend's house. This was not unusual. The girls had been friends for years and were practically inseparable. A few days later, her mother got a call from the friend's mother. She asked to speak to her daughter, saying that the girls had told her they were staying at Nina's house. It was then that Nina's mother learned that her friend had developed a pattern of running away for 3 or 4 days at a time. Her mother tried to stop her without any success. The friend's mother told Nina's mother not to worry, that the girls would certainly come home in a couple of days. But Nina's mother was worried. She phoned Nina's friends. She called the youth shelter. She called the youth society. She called every organization that she could think of. Despite being deeply concerned, Nina's mother fully expected that the girls would return home in a day or two. Given her previous experience with Child and Family Services, it's not surprising that Nina's mother didn't call the police. 2 days later, Nina's mother learned that the body of a girl Nina's age had been found on the Edmonton Springs golf course. She immediately called the Edmonton Police Service. The police asked her a series of difficult questions. Did she have a habit? Did she drink? Had she run away before? They asked for a picture of Nina. When they came back the next day, Picha, Nina's mother, knew that it was her. She was only 13 years old. 5 people, 2 adults and 3 youth, were tried in connection with Nina's murder. One of the adults, Michael Briscoe, was initially acquitted of all charges. The Crown appealed this decision, and in 2008, the Alberta Court of Appeal found that Justice Brian Burrows had erred in his judgment and ordered a retrial. Joseph Laboucan, the other adult charged, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Laboucan appealed in June 2008, but the conviction was upheld. Picha, Nina's mother, is lobbying to have Laboucan declared a dangerous offender. Despite his life sentence, Laboucan is still eligible to apply for the so-called faint hope clause, and Nina's mother intends to do anything that she can to block his application. Of the 3 youths charged, Michael Williams pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 10 years. Williams was sentenced as an adult, but is appealing this decision. Like Laboucan, Nina's mother, Picha, is lobbying to have Williams declared a dangerous offender. There were 2 young women also who were convicted of manslaughter, kidnapping, and aggravated sexual assault. Stephanie Bird and a young woman known only as Buffy, who was also convicted of second-degree murder and aggravated sexual assault in July 2008. She was tried as a young offender and cannot be named. When asked about her experiences with the criminal justice system, Nina's mother is very critical. She argues that sentencing should exclude time served in custody and that a prison sentence should begin on the day of sentencing. She's also lobbying for changes to the Youth Criminal Justice Act so that violent offenders can be named in the media and tried and sentenced as adults. And I'm going to just stop there. I thought that it was really important for us to listen to Nina's story and just think about some of the circumstances there, even the questions that the police asked her mother when she was trying to figure out if it had been her daughter that was discovered on the golf course. It's definitely been a difficult journey for the family, of course, and a horrific crime. So I'm just gonna click here. I'm gonna stop sharing the slides for a moment there and see if, Josh, I'm not sure if we have any opportunity for people to have any reflections or to engage in any discussion at this point. I noticed there's some.
Yeah, we have 2 questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so I could read the first one if you want.
Sure.
We have both are from anonymous attendees, which are totally cool with these kind of discussions. Do you think the conflict between law enforcement and Indigenous communities can partially be rooted in the sacredness of women in Indigenous communities going against general misogyny, sexism, and other negative feelings towards women present in Western societies?
What an interesting question that is. I mean, if we think about it in terms of our traditional teachings and in terms of intergenerational, matriarchal traditions and the sacredness of women and girls in our communities, of course, it's definitely diametrically opposed, to misogyny, sexism, and negative feelings towards women present in Western society. But I think there's even a layer that goes beyond that. I mean, in terms of the experiences, discussions, readings, personal experiences, there tends to be, sort of taking things to the next level in terms of the level of racism, hatred, hypersexualization, stereotyping that Indigenous women experience in Canada. And, I don't want to say anything too controversial about law enforcement, but I think that it's probably undeniable, and I think some of our law enforcement colleagues certainly would agree that those types of attitudes in terms of misogyny, sexism, racism, hypersexualization, and stereotyping exist, when it comes to certain individuals working in the areas of justice and law enforcement as well. So, I think there can be lots of different reasons for conflict between law enforcement and Indigenous communities and nations across Canada. And I think definitely the diametrically opposed worldview could definitely be one of the reasons. And thank you so much for bringing up that point and that question.
That was a great answer too, Victoria. That was a good answer. The next question would be, excuse me. Do you think that the lack of discovery of what exactly happened to many missing and murdered Indigenous women can hinder healing of Indigenous communities and family members? And what advice do you have for this?
Okay, I'm just going to read this again. Do you think that the lack of discovery of what exactly happened to many missing and murdered Indigenous women can hinder healing? Oh, absolutely. If we think about, not only the layers of loss, the layers of grieving that happens when a family member is murdered or a loved one is murdered, lack of discovery of what happened if a woman, girl, two-spirited person, anyone, if that person is missing on top of that, the family, just from, I'm reflecting about some of the experiences that I've had with families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the uncertainty, the worry, the horror that happens with that uncertainty, not knowing, if the person is still alive, if they're okay, what happened to them, are they suffering? I can only imagine what kind of agony that is. And in terms of hindering healing, it's like an open wound. And I think about some of the people that I worked with just prior to COVID. We had the opportunity to go and support and sit with many families in Saskatchewan who had family members who were either missing or murdered. And I think the experience of being together, of being listened to, of having access to elders, traditional healing, and just safe space to be able to process emotions, to be able to be held and supported both physically and emotionally by safe people who care for those families and care for the mothers, sisters, cousins, aunties, friends. Those opportunities are really, really important because the suffering, it just keeps continuing. So I'm just reflecting, I'm just really holding in my heart right now, and I'm actually seeing one of the mom's faces just really acutely in my mind right now, and just hoping that she's continuing to have people wrapped around her and wrapped around her children who are also suffering with that loved one being missing. I think touching into community support, traditional support, elders, and whatever we can do as communities and families to wrap around will help that healing. But really, the uncertainty of not knowing is very, very difficult.
Okay, so we have two other questions. How is the hypersexualization more prevalent with Indigenous women and girls?
Okay, thank you, Ellen, for that question. I think that sorry, I just had another little note pop in here, all of the distractions of technology. So I think we can probably all agree that in our modern society right now, there's definitely a hypersexualization of women and girls that does occur, that can occur, and that our media definitely contributes to. When I'm talking in our presentation today about a more enhanced hypersexualization of Indigenous women and girls, I guess I'm talking about situations in which there may be an assumption, either by members of the public or police or social workers, maybe an assumption that an Indigenous woman is more easy or available for sex, may be involved in sex work. Those types of assumptions or those types of stereotypes about Indigenous women And I don't have a hypersexualization study that contrasts ethnicity or Indigenous versus non Indigenous and the experience of hypersexualization, but it's definitely threaded through the work that we do, the experiences of myself and other Indigenous women, and it's something I think that we should talk about further. And I hope I'm answering your question in a reasonable way, but I think what we're talking about is those situations where there may be an assumption about sexual availability, sexual morals, or involvement in sex work. I think that's what we're talking about here. And that can happen more frequently to Indigenous women, especially Indigenous women and girls who are visibly identifiable as Indigenous. What do you think, Josh? Was that an okay answer?
Yeah, no, your answers are great. It's not my place to tell you, in that sense. But no, I think you're giving really like I'm learning myself from these responses. So
Okay.
no, you're doing a really great job. So we have one more, and this one says you had mentioned a woman was a victim of two men in her community. Was this community and those responsible Indigenous or not?
hmm I was making reference to a woman who I had known and worked with, Pamela, and in her case, from what I understand, from what I've heard from people that I know, what I read in the news reporting, is that the two people that murdered her were members of her own community. I'm making the assumption that they were Indigenous, but I don't know from the media reporting that I read whether they were or not. So I would just have to sort of suspend my answer there.
Well, thank you everyone for the questions so far. Absolutely put in some more. We have more opportunities for these kind of discussions. So, yeah, just thank you everyone for participating. It looks like there was another one. Um, if you want to answer this one, and then you can get this one's just a kind of a reply back to Alan.
Oh,
Um, so Alan says, thank you. So hypersexualization is more where men would expect that it would be easier, less risky, easier to get away with it.
I think that that might be connected to hypersexualization, yes, and um, I think that's kind of, yeah, easier, less risky, easier to get away with it. I think that's well put. Thank you, Alan. Okay, so if it's okay with you, I am going to resume sharing, and then we can get back to some more questions at our next pause. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. What kinds of things about us or in terms of our life experience might make us more vulnerable to the experience of going missing or perhaps being murdered? So if we think about some of the life experiences that some of us might have had, we might have experienced physical violence, sexual violence as either children or adults, gender specific violence, for example, domestic violence in a relationship, sexual labor violence for those who might have worked in sex work or been members of, working in sex trade, accused victim relationships. So the relationships in which we might have, experienced any of these types of things. Social demographics for violent victimization tell us that these are risk factors. If we are Aboriginal or we have an identity as an Indigenous people, our biological sex, for example, being female, may be more of a vulnerability factor in terms of our experiences of violence, being a woman or a girl. Our gender may make us more vulnerable. And as you know, we're talking about people who are 2S LGBTQIA plus today in the presentation. Sexual orientation may be a factor of vulnerability. Our age, our marital status, and where we live, our geography. So I just want to acknowledge one of my colleagues, Janine Stingel, who does a lot of research for us in terms of exactly what makes Indigenous women and Métis women more vulnerable. And so she's really helping us to understand what some of the demographics and the experiences are surrounding issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So definitely Indigenous women experience some different responses to violence. So police response may look different. Satisfaction with police response may look different. Spousal violence risk after police involvement. Responses of the criminal justice system towards an Indigenous woman or Indigenous person. Interactions with social services. Victims' use of services. The reasons that we might report violence and the reasons why we may choose not to report violence. Delays in reporting, the perceptions of the police, and the perceptions of safety. What feels safe to us, what feels risky to us may be different than other members of the general Canadian population. So when we think about the impacts of violence that we experience, it varies on the level of injury that we've experienced, the frequency of violence that we've experienced, the emotional impacts of violence, and societal impacts and economic costs. So those are all factors that undermine the safety of Indigenous women and Indigenous people. Oh, repeat there. Just hold on one sec. All right. Okay. So thinking about some other social determinants that might add to our layers of vulnerability could be health or disability status, housing, and I don't know about Edmonton right now, if it's as crucial as it is here, but we're having a housing crisis over in BC. And I just want to pause about housing just for a moment. When I was working doing frontline services with women who are impacted by violence and trauma, housing was definitely a major source of vulnerability, with women either choosing to stay in abusive or violent relationships longer than they would have normally because of lack of access to safe housing. In some cases, women that I worked with traded sex for housing in order to have a place to stay. And other women were either living out of cars, in some cases living in encampments or in outdoor tent type settings in tent cities, or couch surfing because of the housing crisis that we're experiencing here. So that's definitely a source of vulnerability. Having the status as a mother or a caregiver. Employment, whether we're experiencing full or part-time or we're unemployed, either having an income or not. Level of education. Do we have the experience of intergenerational trauma or a social history of trauma? And then lifestyle characteristics. And those, when we talk about lifestyle characteristics, that may be some of the choice making around how we earn money, whether we partake in drugs or alcohol, whether we may struggle with, substance use issues, things like that. And then thinking a little bit about, if we have a history of criminal offenses, do we have a criminal history? Is that something that might add an extra layer of vulnerability in terms of how we're living? And then thinking about, people who are faced with the situation of reintegrating, if they have had a criminal involvement in the past and are transitioning out of institutionalized life. So there are some special circumstances and needs around that. Okay, so I think I'll just go into some statistics before we pause for our next discussion here. So I wanted to bring up a few just infographics and talk about some of the percentages here. And so 50% of human trafficking victims in Canada are Indigenous women and girls. So less than 5% of the total Canadian population is Indigenous. So just ponder that for a moment. So Less than 5% of the total Canadian population is Indigenous, and Indigenous women and girls are a fraction of that percentage, and yet we're 50% of human trafficking victims in Canada. So that, when we talk about disproportionate experiences of Indigenous women and girls, we're definitely seeing that huge representation in terms of human trafficking. And if we think about the number of sorry about that, people are very inappropriately trying to get a hold of me today while I'm presenting. Sorry about that. So, but if we think about human trafficking just for a moment, and we think about some of those vulnerability factors that I just talked about, you can see how pieces start to fit together, and just how vulnerable Indigenous women and girls can be in this country. And, I think about often, like how can I help to make that change in terms of shifting those statistics and shifting those levels of vulnerability. And, just imagine if we as communities were even just a bit more proactive about, increasing supports and increasing safety, and how much of a difference can we make. So I'm just kind of planting that seed there. So on to some next statistics here, and these are BC based. So 60% of sexually exploited youth in Vancouver are Indigenous. So when we're talking about sexual exploitation, again, we're talking about experiences that may be sexual exploitation in terms of sex trade, that it may be sexual exploitation in terms of luring, it may be sexual exploitation in terms of other scenarios facing youth. But 60% Indigenous is a really high statistic. And this is from Statistics Canada. Indigenous women between 25 and 44 with Indian status are 5 times more likely than other women of the same age cohort to die because of violence. So for women with Indian status in that age bracket, 25 to 44, they're 5 times more likely to die because of violence. Those are huge statistics. So just how much violence do Indigenous women and girls experience? Ascertaining the exact number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is difficult. RCMP data suggests figures of around 1,200, as Josh mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, whereas databases kept by Indigenous women's groups suggest the number could be over 4,000. Most of what we study comes from official crime data, which has not included information about race until this year. Further, not every case of violence is reported to police or nonprofit organizations. Survivors may choose not to report for a wide range of reasons, and the unfortunate reality is that many women and girls do not live to tell their story. What we do know from the information that we have, however, is clear. Indigenous women and girls experience violence much more frequently and much more severely than non-Indigenous women and girls. Statistically speaking, we know that Indigenous women and girls represent 24% of female homicide victims, despite the fact that Indigenous people account for less than 5% of the overall population. The rate at which Indigenous women and girls are killed has continued to increase, whereas the rate at which non-Indigenous women and girls has declined over time. The rate at which Indigenous women report experiencing sexual assault is more than 3 times higher than non-Indigenous women. Indigenous women report experiencing spousal violence at a rate of twice of that of non-Indigenous women. So 15% reporting spousal violence versus 6% of the non-Indigenous population. Indigenous women are more likely to be injured as a result of spousal violence, 59% versus 41%. And 52% of Indigenous women who report violence are more likely to fear for their lives than 31% of non-Indigenous women. So I'll just share a few more statistics here, and then we can pause for some more discussion and some more questions. So, as I'd mentioned before, Indigenous women between 25 and 44 with Indian status are 5 times more likely than other women of the same age cohort to die because of violence. The murder cases of Indigenous women might be less likely to be solved than those involving non-Indigenous women. Only 53% of the murder cases that the Native Women's Association of Canada's Sister in Spirit database have been solved, as compared to 84% of murder cases across Canada. So that's 53% of the murder cases in NWAC's Sisters in Spirit database have been solved, compared with 84% of murder cases across Canada. Indigenous women are almost 3 times more likely to be killed by a stranger than non-Indigenous women. According to RCMP data, 94% of human trafficking cases involve victims trafficked from places within Canada, with Indigenous women being overrepresented among the victims. Further studies suggest that roughly 50% of human trafficking victims are Indigenous women and girls. And as I mentioned previously, 60% of sexually exploited youth in Vancouver are Indigenous. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. That was a lot of information that I just parroted out at you there, where we're talking about maybe some root causes or things happening in life, and then talking about some statistics. So let's pause for a minute and let's talk some more. Can the presentation be sent to us? How about Josh and I talk about maybe a PDF or something like that? If we can work something like that up, how does that sound?
Yeah, we can make sure folks get access to the slides and all that kind of stuff for sure.
Okay. Okay. So I don't know if there's any, oh, here we go. Let's see, do we have a new, oh, no.
Thank
Oh,
you. Yeah,
okay.
no, absolutely though. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no. And if anyone has any questions or even just any comments or anything like that, um, yeah, absolutely put some forward. But I do also understand too with these topics that there's a lot of information and it is kind of heavy, and
Mhm,
sometimes the questions don't pop up until a bit later and that kind of stuff too. So
mhm,
um,
absolutely.
uh, that too, if any of you have questions that pop up later, you can absolutely, as I said, kind of really, you can get a hold of me and Victoria for sure, and we can get back to you with responses in regards to that. But yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, we can absolutely.
Maybe I'll just mention something just for a quick moment. Just sort of, I'm thinking about being strength-based. I had the privilege of working with survivors of trauma and violence for over 15 years here in my community on Vancouver Island, and I do really want to say and reflect about, even though we as Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous women, may experience increased layers of vulnerability, and statistically we have, more of a chance of experiencing violence and trauma. I really have felt blessed to be a witness so many times, time and time again, in terms of the strength and the resilience and the commitment to healing and the commitment to success that I've been able to witness over the years, and working with all the women and girls that I had the pleasure of working with, and especially the Indigenous sisters that I had an opportunity to work with over the years. So I just really want to focus on that too.
So we got 3 questions now, I think, anyway.
Okay.
So the first one was, what kind of preventative or intervention measures can communities focus on to address the statistics that you brought up and mentioned?
Mhm. Okay, amazing. So we're really we're talking about the kind of work that we're proposing in the National Action Plan, and in terms of preventative intervention measures, I can, just reflect on some of the priorities and the calls to action that we did in the work that we did with women of the Métis Nation. We focused on investments and improvements in terms of how the child and family child welfare, child and family services, the kind of investments needed for preventative types of interventions with families and with families who are vulnerable, with children's, teens, and youth who are vulnerable. That the earlier that we can be proactive in terms of helping a family when they're at risk, rather than allowing people to kind of fall into the spot where, children are taken away and isolated. The more early intervention and preventative work that we can do in our families and communities can help ease some of the vulnerability and the risk factors that people may experience. The prioritizing of our own people, our own families, and our own nations to be involved in those types of proactive interventions or prevention services are really important. We also talked about things like the need for culturally safe and culturally based treatment in terms of substance use, treatment in terms of allowing people to heal from trauma, and just how important it is to have those types of healing services accessible and available for both adults and youth. Those are some of the things that we looked at. We looked at also some of the success stories that are out there in terms of community safety, community policing. We looked at even international cases of things like women's police stations being very successful in Latin American countries, for example. And if I'm remembering the statistics correctly, when we looked at the pilot programs for women-only police stations, they had an amazing impact in terms of women seeking assistance, intervention, reporting of violence, can dramatically increase with some of these innovative ways of approaching policing and justice. So I'm going to stop with, just those three examples there. But when we were looking at as a nation and as a community, what kinds of best practices or what kinds of information actions that we would want to prioritize, those are just a few examples. And if you take a look at the National Action Plan, and again, Josh and I can take a look at the link and send that out. There's all kinds of innovative ideas that are coming from Indigenous people and Indigenous communities ourselves. You're thinking about what would work within our nation, what would work within our community, and looking at some of those innovative solutions.
Okay. Yeah, no, that was great. Before we get to the next two questions, there's just a quick comment from Monique. I know Monique. She's really wonderful. She says, as someone who works in the field of domestic violence, we know the increased vulnerability, but the stats are really eye-opening, Marseille. So she really appreciated that. And then she also has a session of introduction to family violence next week through her organization. I think that's what it's called, the Today Center, online, no cost. So she put that in the link if anyone wants to attend that too. That sounds like it would be one that's, if anyone wants to learn more about that, absolutely. So thanks for sharing that, Monique, and awesome you're able to join us for this session. So we have two questions. This one says, how is the effects of alcohol different for Indigenous girls and women? And is there a different effect for them in that sense? I would even think.
That one, I really appreciate the question. And I just don't have access to that kind of, sort of demographically sort of tested information on that. So I'm sorry. You'll have to maybe find that information elsewhere.
You never know. We might have a speaker that comes up that can answer. Our previous one was Dr. Pam Roach. I think she was the previous one. We've done that's how you know we've done. Oh yeah, she was the previous one because this one's number 3. But she might be one to reach out to for that. But the next one, in the stat on solved murders, would the 84% include all cases thereby making the disparity worse since the 57% Indigenous solved cases were included and bring the 84% down? I don't know. I don't know if you can
You know,
answer that one or.
that's a really interesting question because we're partnering right now with the RCMP and with other uh, we're partnering, sorry, someone just walked into the room here. We're partnering right now with the RCMP and with Statistics Canada and with Justice Canada. And I'd mentioned earlier in our presentation that a lot of crime statistics in the past haven't had that demographic carve out. So I think what you're stating here is really important. I don't have the answer today. However, when we go back to the table for our next meeting with StatsCan and with Justice, and as we talk with our colleagues in the RCMP, I think this is really important to bring up. Now, I do just want to comment, the statistic that I was quoting from, I drew from the Native Women's Association of Canada, and the Sisters in Spirit database that they maintain, it's largely a grassroots populated database that they work on and that their staff helps to maintain. And so it certainly would differ from, that 84% statistic that we would be looking at with Stats Canada or with Justice Canada. So you make a good point, and that's definitely something that, in terms of the continuing work that we have on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that I'll be very mindful of. So I know my answer isn't really an answer, but I really want to thank you sincerely for bringing that up.
Yeah, no, I think thanks for everyone who's been bringing the questions forward, and of course everyone who's attending today's session. No, I think we've, as I say, I've learned a lot already just from these responses and hearing you talk, Victoria. So, no, this has been, yeah, this has been great so far. So, is there any other questions? If not, we can go forward for a bit more and then do
Sure.
probably a good another round of discussion or something along the lines.
Sounds good. Okay, should I pop into the Q&A? Oh, no, there we go. We got the last one. And thank you, Roland, for engaging in the conversation. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation here. Okay, so why do Indigenous women and girls experience such disproportionately high rates of violence? So while each individual woman and girl has their own unique set of exposures to violence, studies by academic institutions, government agencies, and non-governmental organizations have consistently identified several systemic factors placing Indigenous women and girls at risk. Studies suggest that after factors like educational attainment and employment are controlled for, Indigenous people are roughly 3 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than non-Indigenous people. Several studies, including the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, have concluded that one-way racism against Indigenous women and girls often manifests through the over-sexualization of their bodies. So that's what we were talking about before in the question. Indigenous women and girls are often portrayed and perceived as inherently sexually available, leading to a cultural evaluation of violence against them as lesser. Because of cultural values we have surrounding sexuality, this also predisposes Indigenous women and girls to being perceived as inherently more inferior, deviant, and dysfunctional, even though this isn't true. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay, so these racist ideas about Indigenous women and girls may explain why trafficking and sexual exploitation of them is often portrayed as a problem of consensual sex work rather than abuse in both policy and media. It also may explain why issues concerning Indigenous girls are often absorbed into the umbrella of Indigenous women's issues. So if we think about that for a moment, we looked at that statistic about Indigenous youth being sexually exploited. In Vancouver, those statistics, where it was 60% Indigenous youth being victims of sexual exploitation, 50% of human trafficking victims being Indigenous women and girls. So when we think about it, it's exploitation of Indigenous children, you know. So we're bringing these issues together, that it's women and girls experiencing them. So really, we need to also think about the fact that it's children experiencing, these types of violence and exploitation. So being mindful about that. So the next slide here that I have talks about Indigenous peoples have been socioeconomically marginalized due to systemic oppression. So this is definitely another factor. Among Indigenous people specifically, the unemployment rate is more than double that of non-Indigenous people in Canada, and a lack of culturally sensitive, low barrier services leaves Indigenous women with fewer resources should they choose to flee from violence. Furthermore, poverty amongst Indigenous people can force Indigenous women and girls into precarious situations. You remember I was talking with you earlier about when I was doing frontline work and, housing unstable women that I was working with were having to make really difficult choices because of a shortage of housing, shortage of safe housing, and not being, economically strong enough to be able to compete in a over competitive housing market. That's a perfect example. Indigenous peoples make 33% less money per year on average than non-Indigenous people. Further, 84% of on-reserve households do not have enough income to cover the cost of adequate housing. Without other options, many women are forced to resort to a means of subsistence, such as participating in street-level sex work or moving to an unfamiliar city without many resources or supports to make ends meet. Colonization and the residential school system. These have created intergenerational trauma. For many Indigenous women and girls, abuse is normalized as they grow up, making it harder for them to recognize their relationships as such. Scholars have argued that the violence that Indigenous families and communities, or that violence in Indigenous families and communities is almost always linked to individual or collective trauma and the need for healing, resulting from colonization and the impact of residential schools. Within the residential school system, laws mandated that children were forcibly removed from their homes, forcibly removed from their communities and taken to boarding schools away from their communities. Sexual, physical, and mental abuse were rife at the schools, with children being deliberately and systemically starved at some. The effects this abuse had on individual lives is immeasurable, and the thorough and systemic nature of it effectively ensured it would continue through the generations. After all, where do you learn how to cope with your trauma in a productive manner and become a healthy parent when everyone around you is still learning how to deal with their own abuse? Okay, so I wanted to bring it back to one of our sisters, to a real experience of a mother, a woman, a Cree Métis woman named Cindy Gladu, who I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. And I just want to talk about her a little bit here. So Cindy Gladu, whose picture we have featured here, was 36 years old, a mother of 3 children, and on June 22nd, 2011, she was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room. She bled to death from an 11-centimeter wound to her vagina. On March 18th, 2015, a jury found Bradley Barton not guilty of first-degree murder. In June 2017, the Alberta Court of Appeal has overturned Barton's acquittal and ordered a new trial. The appeal court decision said that there were flaws in the way that the jury was instructed to consider sexual assault offenses and the laws relating to consent. Barton's lawyer appealed, saying the appeal court's ruling is flawed. In March 2018, it was announced that the Supreme Court would review the order for a new trial. And on February 20th this year, after all of that, February 20th, 2021, he was convicted of manslaughter. So this is a very, very tragic case. It was a very violent case. And the Women of the Métis Nation, the organization that I work for, we were an intervener on this case. And definitely supported, the need for an appeal. Um, you know, in the way that, Cindy was abused and violently assaulted, and she died as a result of her injuries. There were further indignities to her and to her family, just in the criminal justice process that happened while Bradley Barton was being prosecuted. And in this case, you may remember seeing in the media that, unfortunately, as part of the process, when evidence was being presented during the trial, um, they presented her genitalia separated from her body in the court process. So, when we think about ways in which Indigenous women can be dehumanized or experience a lack of dignity, just looking at that example, um, that's not something that I can ever recall hearing of before. But that's what happened, in the process of this trial. And Cindy has a very beautiful mother, Donna, that we provide support for, as she undergoes this process. And we encourage and support some of the elders that wrap around her as she has to go through these experiences at these criminal proceedings. I can't imagine what it would be like to be at the murder trial of my daughter and to have a piece of her body on display as evidence during that trial. So for us as an organization, for us as Indigenous women, this is an example of, not only an Indigenous woman experiencing indignity and horrible violence and a terrible outcome in life, but further continuing that experience of indignity and violence, even in her death and in the criminal proceedings, trying to get justice for what happened to her. So this is definitely a very emotional case. The issues that we're talking about today about vulnerabilities and about stereotyping, about the experience of racism, about the intersections, between the justice system and policing and mainstream attitudes of hypersexualization and stereotyping. All of these things come together and connect in this case. And so I think it's a really important one to think about. And at the beginning of our presentation here, I mentioned that I wanted to dedicate the time that we're spending together, that I'm spending with you, to Pamela, and then to Cindy. And again, I really want to acknowledge the center and acknowledge Josh, because I feel really good that some of the time that we spend together today will get to flow through in terms of some financial support for Donna as she incurs the expenses of still participating in the justice system processes surrounding the death of Cindy. So I'm just going to pause there. I'm going to stop sharing. So we had a chance to talk about another case, and we had a chance to think about, even just us gathering here today will have a positive support impact for her mother, which, we talked about impacts on family and survivors earlier. So I'm popping back into the chat here. How can the non-Indigenous community help to support the healing and create change in the systemic factors that impact our women and girls? What a great question that is. And I have some ideas, and I'm really hoping that others in the discussion group today have ideas as well. I think that there's a number of actions that we can take. I think that there's a number of things that we can do. I think non-Indigenous community helping to support healing. Well, we can think about that at an individual level, a family level, a community level, a societal level. It might be something like It could be financial support. It could be donations to services that provide, frontline supports and tangible supports to Indigenous women, children, and families. It may be at an individual level. How can you support healing of Indigenous communities? I think I would reflect about that and maybe even think about where you're situated. Is there support that you can give in terms of individual actions, in terms of maybe trying to raise awareness and increase empathy and compassion and support within your family circle, your social circle, your work circle, your employment circle, your community circle? I was giving a speech about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls several years ago, and I issued a challenge to everybody. There was lots of non-Indigenous people there. And one of the things that I said, and sort of issued a challenge to all the non-Indigenous people that were there, is that if they ever witnessed or observed a woman or a girl who seemed like she wasn't in a safe situation, to take action, whether that would be calling 911, whether that would be asking if she was okay or if she needed assistance, not just passing by or letting the situation go if you noticed that something was wrong, that a woman or a girl was vulnerable. And I'm not saying to put yourself at risk or anything like that, but really treating all members of our community like we would members of our family, or our school community or work community or our neighborhood, really making sure that we're looking out for each other. And in terms of systemic change, what does that look like in terms of a political or a social action that you could take to help promote increased safety, promote more positive community policing, increasing accountability in terms of some of the systems that surround us. We were all touched. Let's use Joyce Echaquan as an example. I think we were all touched in Canada when we saw that video, about sometimes the devastating consequences of systemic racism. So how can we as individuals make a difference? Well, I think it's making that personal commitment, sometimes a financial commitment, sometimes an action commitment, sometimes an activism commitment, to show that you care and to back up that care by taking some type of a substantive action. What do you think? I'm really curious about people's ideas in the audience. What kinds of action would you commit to today to helping, make some change and help support the traction that we're trying to make in terms of turning these circumstances and experiences and statistics around? Would love to hear from people in the audience.
Yeah, feel free to use the chat feature. Could even type it in the Q&A part. We'll definitely check it out. That's a great question from Victoria. Is there anything you would feel that you would want to commit to, that you feel comfortable? And Dawn, speaking up when someone says something derogatory about Indigenous women. Yeah, and that's a great example. that's honestly a really good example. I always think, if you're having the classic, you're having dinner at the table and you might be having, quite heavy discussion. Someone says something and it's like, well, hey, that's actually not true. And just question them on that, having resources that I can direct women in need to. Yeah, that's a good one too, because there's some cases where the access to resources, they don't know where to go, and even is this resource a safe one to approach and all that kind of stuff. So absolutely. Sharing awareness of these statistics. Yes, yeah, education right there, Leah, absolutely. I've been hoping to sign up for a sexual violence prevention intervention course. Yeah, and that is a good suggestion for that. You might not think at first that, oh, this is impacting, but you know what, that would actually be very beneficial. So that's a great suggestion there.
That is fantastic. Well, and especially like that idea too of intervention. Like, I know in BC here, there's a program called Be More Than a Bystander, and it's a program for men who want to intervene when they notice men, doing some behaviors that are really inappropriate. Could be about, sexual violence prevention or other things. What a great idea, Jesse. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, we have a saying that's been coined from someone here that they call it "make it awkward." So if you see someone doing something that's not right, you question them on it, and exactly, make it awkward for them. You know, and as Victoria said, we're not telling you to put yourself in harm's way, but it's when you have those opportunities that you can do something.
Mm.
Um, I think first and foremost, it is important to stay and continue to be educated, never stop wanting to learn. And through this, we can increase accountability from non-Indigenous culture. That's a very, yeah, well thought out response. And even in our communities, I've heard from lots of elders that like, they say that they're still learning. Like we are forever learning, truthfully. So yeah, absolutely. I think that was a really good response.
Mhm, absolutely. I really want to express my gratitude to the center and to you, Josh. This is such a huge topic, and I wasn't quite sure how to approach this. So I hope that the kinds of ways that we looked at this issue together were useful in terms of stimulating some ideas and discussion. And I really want to express my gratitude to all of the participants as well. Oh, and Michelle. As a non-Indigenous social worker, I work really hard to educate myself and stand up for things I see wrong. It's amazing. Hi,
And
Michelle.
we
Nice to
have
see
two more from Alan. Alan actually brought some more in from the Q&A, and he says, I am from Lethbridge. We are just training people on the systems navigator training, which is encouraging people to recognize violence, encouraging them to extend help and know where the resources are to help. Menchie says, my neighbor's strength is my strength. Yeah, and that's a great, absolutely. And I'm a full believer of that. From our Indigenous community perspective, if someone is struggling in our community, that means our community is struggling. And until that person is being helped and being that struggle is being addressed, only then we can claim that we are on that aspect of healing. So I think that was a really great point there you brought up there, Alan. And no, I that's the nice part about these, Victoria, is I like to like keep these, they are, it's laid back in a sense, but it's absolutely here to educate people of the general public and anyone who generally wants to learn on the topics that we are talking about. And today is a very heavy, very important, just so much to unpack when it comes to talking
you.
about missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I think approaching it that way, where it's just, you kind of go with the flow and you just see what fits best, I think was the best approach. And yeah, no, I just want to thank you for uh, spending the time with us today and having all the participants here also with us. Kirsten said, I'm a third year BSW student from Sudbury, Ontario. Oh, cool. We have people from Ontario. Really cool. I think it is so important to listen to and highlight the voices of Indigenous women and girls, voices that have been and continue to be delegitimated. I like how you said that there, and silence when it comes to fighting for the deep rooted changes that Canadian society so desperately needs. Appreciate you for sharing your knowledge with us today, Victoria. A huge thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kirsten. And I just want to put a little plug in the chat,
Mhm.
just for a moment here, and let you know about a program that my colleagues at La Femme Chiff work on, and it's called sheIsIndigenous.ca. And when Kirsten mentioned, highlighting and listening to and celebrating the successes of Indigenous women and girls, She is Indigenous profiles on an ongoing basis. Um, Indigenous women and girls who have some type of success or contribution or something that they're passionate about in terms of the work that they do in their community. And so it's a way that we can share, the passionate and compassionate and leaders and workers and people who are wise and elders and youth, and just share that amongst, you know, all of Canada. So please check out sheIsIndigenous.ca. It's one of the programs that we work on just to try to share positive, strength-based information and to help highlight a positive, strength-based, resilient face and story in terms of Indigenous women in Canada.
Yeah, and I totally second that. Check out sheIsIndigenous.ca. They even have a Facebook page, so you can check them out on Facebook and get to their website that way. And it's a really, really wonderful initiative. I've been really have been enjoying following that page, honestly. So we don't have much time left. We're already at 2:30 where I come at, but I just wanted to give folks a quick chance if they wanted to see how to contact. Oh, now we're all the way at the front. Let me get to the end here. And thankfully my presentation isn't. But just to, if you want to continue to get a hold of us, you can contact us at 780-425-4644. You can also email us at info@cfrac.com if you're interested in any more events like these. We also do ones on anti-racism called Challenging Discrimination. So anything like this that you feel is up your alley, absolutely check us out and email that info@cfrac. We also have a website too that can keep you up to date on all initiatives. There's Facebook, there's Instagram, there's the Twitter. I actually don't know, believe it or not, what this symbol is. That Indeed? I think that might be Indeed or one of the ones.
It's LinkedIn, my
Oh,
friend.
LinkedIn. There you go. I was like, that actually makes sense. So check us out on LinkedIn. And yes, I just want to thank everyone for participating in today's session. I'm just going to quickly stop sharing, and I just want to read. There are a couple more that I just want to quickly get through to check out. Marseille, and Victoria, thank you for an incredible presentation. I appreciated your ability to deal with the impacts of this violence against Indigenous women. That includes the data that is available, advocating for better data, particularly the way you were able to share this information in a way that is very safe and allows others to really hear. Much appreciated. Hand over heart. Awesome. Thank you both for your service to the community. Marseille. Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you, Josh and Victoria. I am non-Indigenous woman on a mission to gain the knowledge. That's awesome. I'm very appreciative, everyone. I'm very glad this is what you wanted in this session, and that this hope has inspired you to, even if it's just simply to learn more. I believe that's taking that step in that regard. So once again, let me thank you to Victoria. I think you did very well for this session, and yeah, you never know, maybe we'll be able to do another one in the future with you for sure in that case.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you to the Center for Race and Culture, and thank you to all the participants.
I'll see everyone later. Take care, everyone. Marseille.